What's good? It's Woog. Canelo Alvarez, as expected, handled this business against mandatory challenger Avni Yildirim. It didn't take an expert or even looking at the betting odds to know that this was a big mismatch, and that was the perception going in. Avni Yildirim he's not a complete slouch. He fought a very spirited decision loss, stopped on a cut, close scorecards type of fight versus former champ Anthony Dirrell. But in this fight versus Canelo, he seemed slightly more effective than a punching bag. I mean, and I say punching bag, meaning heavy bag, just because of his lack of movement. He was allowing Canelo to set up shop right in front of him and let his hands go. That's like the one thing you don't want to do against Canelo, aside from just like running in on him. James Kirkland, for instance, you could really just get your lights put out. At least if you're standing still, you're kind of absorbing the punches as they're coming. You're not running into oncoming traffic. So Avni Yildirim was no match for him. Canelo finished him in 3 rounds, and so that sets up the next fight between Canelo and WBO champ Billy Joe Saunders, which works perfectly for Eddie Hearn, Matchroom, since he's representing Canelo this last fight and the fight before that against Callum Smith, and now this next fight against Billy Joe Saunders. What happens beyond that, yet to be determined. But Canelo, for this next fight, is also with Matchroom. Eddie Hearn, Matchroom, also promotes Billy Joe Saunders, all on DAZN, so we know what time it is. This fight will be taking place in early May. And my first thoughts on this matchup is that it's very likely heading to the scorecards for a close and disputed decision. Either way, you would have to think that Canelo will probably get more judging love in this one. But if you are more of a boxing conspiracy theorist, you might say, well, if Eddie Hearn is kind of pulling the strings, then maybe the judging could slide in the favor of Billy Joe Saunders, who probably doesn't have a rematch clause. Canelo might. But if Billy Joe Saunders pulls out a close decision win, then that almost guarantees that Canelo's going to want seconds. He's going to want to eat at that table again, and that's just more business for Matchroom Eddie Hearn, as opposed to if Canelo just dusts Billy Joe Saunders and stops him or wins by decision, he would then go on to fight Caleb Plant, who is the only other major belt holder at 168. Caleb Plant is the IBF champ, and he is not promoted by Matchroom. He doesn't fight on DAZN. He's with PBC Al Heyman. So Canelo would probably he would serve himself well getting a stoppage over Saunders, because Saunders is the type of fighter who knows how to win rounds. There are certain fighters that are just really good round winners. I mean, obviously the ones who can knock people out can also win some rounds in a lot of cases. Anthony Joshua wins a lot of rounds. Deontay Wilder, less so. But certain fighters can be without punching power, but still be able to thwart the attacks and win 9 to 11 of the 12 rounds. You see Billy Joe Saunders versus David Lemieux. That's a perfect example of Billy Joe Saunders, when he's really ticking, just making a slugger. He's slightly better than an Avni Yildirim, but somebody who can knock you out if you hang around in the pocket, but you could outbox. And that is just the type of fighter Billy Joe Saunders is. He's crafty. He's every cliche that you want to put on somebody who's just knows how to get out of harm's way, doesn't take major damage, doesn't necessarily always wow the crowd with activity either. You could kind of get lulled into a boring fight where you're just, kind of looking at your watch, and, 7 rounds in, Billy Joe Saunders is in, more or less complete control, but he's not really like putting deadly combinations together, but he's winning the round. Erislandy Lara, another very good round winner. And Erislandy Lara gave Canelo one of his most disputed fights. Canelo won in a close decision. It's pretty split on who people thought won that fight. I could get arguments on both sides. Canelo knows how to frame his punches perfectly, where he just looks like he's making a declaration with every time he lets his hands go, and it just looks brilliant. Erislandy Lara, can look good in certain fights. I thought he looked good in his win against Austin Trout, who was another fighter who gave Canelo trouble in the first half of their fight. It was weird. It was in Texas. They had the announced scoring where every 4 rounds they announce what, who's winning which rounds, which can impact the psychology of the fighter going into the next round. But Erislandy Lara, Billy Joe Saunders are 2 fighters who know how to win rounds, even if they're not just impressing the hell out of you, and even if you're not even excited to see their next fight. There's some of these guys that are brilliant that the casual fan or a lot of fans aren't super excited to see because they don't remember fireworks in their last fight. I will say he does have his charismatic moments in the ring where he's looking like, wow, that just looks brilliant, because of how much more of an understanding of angles and timing and a lot of these nuances he seems to have. But he's also not the guy who's just gonna just hit you with like a flashy looking shot. Now, when Canelo was having these issues with the Erislandy Laras, and it was really just Erislandy Lara and Austin Trout to an extent before the Golovkin fights. Those were kind of the ones that are looked at, more under a microscope, like, did he win? Miguel Cotto is another one, although I thought that Canelo won that by 1 to 2 rounds. Freddie Roach thought that his guy at the time, Cotto, won that fight. I didn't see it that way, but I don't think we're dealing with the same Canelo that we were when he was at 154. I mean, this almost feels like ancient history now because of all of the super quality opponents Canelo has convincingly beaten since. Various styles too. Like his win over Daniel Jacobs at that time, that was like, whoa, like really? Like I thought that was gonna be maybe a 50-50 type fight going in. And obviously the 2 fights with Golovkin, which just has so many different facets to it that you could just write a novel about it. So I'll spare that one for in this video. But point being, Canelo has now more or less seen it all. Not to mention fighting one of the greatest, absolute greatest to ever do it in Floyd Mayweather. I mean, the type of experience this stuff gives you is really priceless. Like, there are few resumes, and it's only the greats, the greatest of greats, that have these type of resumes where you look at the list of the guys that, that he's been in the ring with, and you just shake your head and you just forget that, yeah, that many years have passed, and yes, he has not let up on the boxing game. If anything, he has continuously just put his foot down on the gas a little harder, went up to 175 to, challenge Sergey Kovalev, and then eventually knock him out in dramatic fashion. And even the Alfredo Angulos or Julio Cesar Chavez Jr. Like, I mean, say what you want about Chavez, especially in recent years, but, Chavez is not a comfortable guy to be in the ring with. Like, he is always coming in overweight, underprepared, but he wreaks havoc, man. He obviously has tools, you know what I'm saying? Like, he's got a lot of physical gifts. Look up Daniel Jacobs' debut at 168. He recently came up to 168. And before this snoozer of a fight between him and Gabriel Rosado, he fought Julio Cesar Chavez Jr. And it was stopped due to, like, cuts. Chavez Jr. ended up quitting. But those first few rounds, like, that was hellacious for Jacobs. He kind of weathered the storm, but a couple things, like unfortunate cuts, broke his way. And in a way, kind of got him off in that one a little bit easy. Granted, if I recall correctly, I think that cut was caused by a punch. So, props to Jacobs for executing on that. But back to the lecture at hand, Canelo Alvarez versus Billy Joe Saunders. I just see some of the things that Saunders does well, still working to an extent. And Canelo's a patient starter. And he's as crafty and prepared a fighter. He's among the very best teams in boxing. He's got Eddie Reynoso, one of the super trainers of today. So Canelo and his team are just like clicking on all cylinders. They're just performing at such high levels at this point that you have to favor Canelo. And I wouldn't be surprised if he's like a 3-1 favorite, 4-1 favorite maybe. But Billy Joe Saunders has a really good chance at kind of getting in a role where Canelo is going to have to figure some things out. And I think that Billy Joe Saunders has a chance at coming out of the first 4 to 5 rounds either tied 2-2 on the scorecards, depending, give or take. These are going to be close rounds. I don't think Canelo's just going to blow Billy Joe Saunders away. That's the thing. Like, I believe that out of potential opponents for Canelo, anything below 175. I'm not going to get into the Dmitry Bivol and Artur Beterbievs, or even the Joe Smith Jr.'s, which, I mean, that would be fun, right? But I look at anything below 175 to rank the difficulty in opponent for Canelo, for his specific style, what, you know, his set of skills. The people who I think would give him the toughest times in order would be David Benavidez at number 2, Jermall Charlo, even if he has to come up to 168, which he would have to do since Canelo's not going back down to 160. If Charlo was able to go to 168 and beat a David Lemieux or somebody who's kind of like a lower end top 10 at 168 and kind of acclimate to the weight class a little bit, I think that that would still be the most difficult challenge for Canelo. I don't know yet who I believe would win that fight. I think it's a very interesting fight, but Charlo would be my one right now, even though, like, I think that Charlo would have trouble. Like, he doesn't want to go up to fight David Benavidez, I believe. Like, he's like, I'm going to take my time and get into the weight class if I'm going to do 168. But anybody would drop whatever they're doing to fight Canelo because it's Canelo. It's not even about belts, even though Canelo has 2, and Benavidez was stripped of his WBC belt for the second time without losing a fight. But Canelo is by far everybody's biggest payday, the biggest catch. Even if you don't have a chance at winning the fight, people would take a fight with Canelo. But after Charlo 1, Benavidez 2, I would say Billy Joe Saunders is 3. And right now, I would say Golovkin is 4 if he goes up to 168. And if he doesn't, Caleb Plant would be the next for me. But I think Golovkin would still pose a bigger problem than Plant. I think Golovkin, I think that the window has closed on Golovkin's maximum effectiveness against Canelo. I think that the height of the window was actually a year or 2 before they eventually fought. That's when I would have loved to have seen that fight. But Golovkin, to me, is just one bad fight away from being a shot fighter. And I don't mean shot as in you can't take a punch. I just mean far enough away from your prime to where your skills are almost unrecognizable if you're truly matching it up against yourself in your prime. I believe Golovkin is naturally headed there, like all fighters are, right? Just Golovkin is now 37, almost 38. I'd have to go and check. But yeah, I'm pretty excited. You know, unlike some, maybe, I'm pretty excited about Canelo versus Billy Joe Saunders. I think it's going to be an interesting fight. You know, I don't mind the sweet science style of fight. I don't mind what Richard Dwyer would call the slow rounds. I don't mind the chess match, you know, but you still have to favor Canelo because he is such an adaptable fighter who's taking in the information and is executing accordingly, you know, and he just has a killer instinct too. Like the way he changes levels, just the way that, like, his punches splash. I mean, I always thought that he had like really laser-like punches, but it's a thing of beauty when he like this was a showcase, an exhibition. It was a much easier fight for Canelo, which I think that he at this point was entitled to, especially when you look at his recent activity. He took on one of the absolute baddest at 168 and made him look like a average fighter. He made him look so bad that people were like, well, he's fighting people like Callum Smith. Look, David Benavidez wasn't fighting Callum Smith. Not Billy Joe Saunders, but Gilberto Ramirez was holding a belt, not fighting, you know, Callum Smith. Caleb Plant wasn't fighting Callum Smith. Canelo went right up to the bigger guy and just hunted him down. And that's what he's been getting so good at, like the hunt. He's a patient killer, man. Canelo's cold, man. Canelo don't play. But I think that Billy Joe Saunders is going to give him a puzzle to solve, if you will. I would have to believe that he is going to solve it, but again, I'm just going to look at more Saunders tapes. He sounded confident as hell in that interview versus in that interview with Mike Coppinger and Lance Pugmire with The Athletic. And if I were to compare his interview there and his tone and his sound of belief with his fellow British recent challengers, Luke Campbell, Callum Smith, and Kell Brook, who for all three, except for Callum Smith, was a champ, And Campbell versus Ryan Garcia wasn't a title fight, but you get what I'm saying. He was kind of the B-side. Even if he were the higher ranked fighter, he was treated as the B-side versus Ryan Garcia. But when I hear their interviews and their tone compared to, you know, unlike them, Billy Joe is actually convincing me in this interview, like, I really think that he thinks he's going to win this fight. Not to say that Luke Campbell didn't go into that fight with Ryan Garcia with complete belief, or same with, you know, Callum Smith or Kell Brook. You know, Kell Brook in his interview with like Max Kellerman and others, I was believing him. I was excited as hell going into Terrence Crawford versus Kell Brook. Like, no, I think we might have a fight on their hand. I think, you know, Kell Brook has one more stroke of genius. But when I hear Billy Joe Saunders in this interview, he actually has me thinking that he thinks he could win this fight. And look, what I think might be his Achilles heel is certain bad habits, like not fully training and not staying in the best of shape and kind of tiring out late in fights. I think that those chickens are going to come home to roost in this fight. I think that one might show. I mean, because habits are habits, you know what I mean? And you would like to think that a professional is going to do the right thing to the nth degree in the biggest moment of their career. And yes, you could catch lightning in a bottle. I do believe that. And I think that maybe Tyson Fury caught that in that second fight with Deontay Wilder, even though I wouldn't bet against Fury in this next fight with Joshua. Fury's looking like a bad boy. But habits matter. And it seems like Canelo's been keeping the right habits and has been super dedicated to this stuff, whereas I've seen a lethargic Billy Joe Saunders in the ring multiple times. Late in his fight with Chris Eubank, in a fight that he won, he was looking tired and just uninspired. But yeah, this should be a cool one. Like keep your eye on this one. I'd actually be curious to see the betting odds, because I'd imagine that the overwhelming thing is going to swing Canelo's way, because he's got so much juice right now and he's just been killing it, fight after fight after fight, even in the disputed ones with Triple G. At the end of the day, he fought Triple G 24 rounds before Derevianchenko. Yes, Triple G might have been a little bit past it, but he fought 24 rounds with Triple G and didn't hit the canvas once. And they were both close fights either way. Like, damn. Like, and I didn't think Canelo was going to be that deadly and that good of a 160-pound fighter. And I damn sure didn't think he was going to be this apparently dominant at 168. He still has business to handle. And like I said, David Benavidez is a scary-looking dude. The way he handled that Anthony Dirrell fight, whew. But those are my first thoughts on Canelo versus Billy Joe Saunders. Please, let me know yours. Leave the comments in the comments, like the video, subscribe to the channel if you are into the fight talk. I'm Woog. Thanks for tuning in.